Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew. I'm the director here at the Adams County Historical Society, and I see a lot of people who've been here yesterday, so I won't read Tim's full and illustrious biography, but Tim Smith is our historian and our director of education. He's been at the Adams County Historical Society for decades. He's a licensed battlefield guide. He's written tons of books and articles about the Battle of Gettysburg and the civilian experience in Adams County, Pennsylvania. And I think this is probably Tim's favorite topic of all of his programs that he gives. There's nobody more associated with rocks and Gettysburg than Tim, who has personally visited, I think, every rock on the Gettysburg battlefield and has named given official names to some of the rocks on the battlefield that have been adopted by the National Park Service. And has discovered rock carvings on the battlefield. I could go on, but I'll let Tim give this program. I think we gave it a long time ago over Zoom, but there's things that you've added, and Tim's always going out looking for more rocks. So I hope you enjoy the program, and thank you, Tim, and thank you for your interest in the Historical Society. Hope you have a chance to see the museum while you're here as well. Thanks.
I have a feeling that this program I'm going to give today is going to ramble on a little bit in different directions. Obviously, like many other people that have visited this battlefield when they were young, I was enamored by the rocks at Devil's Den. And, people like the rocks because you can play on the rocks. Devil's Den, to some people, is a giant jungle gym. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I came here, I was like, wow, it's just an amazing place. There's little cracks and crevices and caves in the rocks of Devil's Den, and you can climb around. But as I spent more time here and became more knowledgeable on the battle, I really started to appreciate the rocks more. And to try to give a simple explanation of it, when you come to Gettysburg, I think people always want to get a feeling of what the battle was like, or a sense of closeness to the actual event. And some people do that by collecting artifacts. They collect like a rifle that was used during the Civil War, and they hold that rifle, and they understand that rifle was used by a Civil War soldier. Or other people reenact. They dress up like the Civil War soldier dressed, and they go out and they are in a mock skirmish to try to get a better feel of what it's like to be there. And I feel the same thing about the rocks. I touch a rock. A Civil War soldier touched that rock. What do we really have on the battlefield that was here during the battle? A couple trees, maybe there's 10, a dozen trees that were here at the time of the battle that still stand, and they were here at the time. The buildings, some of the houses and the homes were here during the battle. But, the rocks were here. And like I said, you can climb up on top of a rock, and maybe a Civil War soldier climbed on that rock also. Now, as I began to appreciate the rocks more and learn more about the rocks, the most famous rock formation, of course, the most famous igneous rock formation being the rocks at Devil's Den in the southern Valley of Death. Here's an 1863 photograph, really the first photograph that shows the massive wall of rocks, a Peter Weaver image in November 1863. But as I learned more about the rocks, I learned that you can use the rocks and the photographs of the rocks to make discoveries that will help us gain more insight to the battle and more insight to the evolution of the Gettysburg National Military Park. And just to give you an illustration here, one of my discoveries is something I refer to as the prop stones on East Cemetery Hill.
Whoa. Some may disagree about you talking about the prop stones, sir. In fact, if I may, I think I coined the term prop stones. I think that some of those prop stones that you see there propping up the cannons or the cannonballs, by the way, I'm Gary Edelman, hello. You can see them there. Some of those are still on East Cemetery Hill. If you look in the walls, you can see a distinctive divot actually where they used to go, and John Archer has actually discovered one version of it where you can see the impressions in the smaller stones where the cannonballs used to sit. That's right at the corner of the north end of the battlefield as it hits Baltimore Pike. You might be able to see one of those. Now, one more thing. Some of these prop stones, I swear, weren't just put into the stone wall. I believe you can see them in a foundation that they laid to put up General Winfield Scott Hancock's monument. So I also think that some of these prop stones used to sit in what we call the middle of Evergreen Cemetery, called the Rocky Center. And they eventually removed those rocks, and I think some of those rocks became prop stones, and that some of those prop stones now sit under the statue of Winfield Scott Hancock, and I discovered it all.
And Gary, in this particular discovery, what does this tell us about the battle?
Absolutely nothing. See you all.
So, yes, Gary made the discovery of the prop stones. So, you know, one of the things that's interesting about Devil's Den and photography, and of course, you know, basically, the study of the rocks is not just to study the rocks themselves, but also the study of the photography of the rocks over the years. And here's a 1880s image recorded at Devil's Den. And I like this particular image. You can kind of see how people carved their name into the rocks, or in some cases painted their names onto the rocks of Devil's Den. And, you know, when I was a kid and I was in the Gettysburg area searching through the flea markets, I found a lot of these images, and over the years I bought images. And I would buy images of families in front of the rocks of Devil's Den, and then I would bring the images to Devil's Den and line the images up with the place that the photograph was taken. And, you know, when I was a kid, these things were easy to get, you know, and maybe I paid $5 or $10 for them. I think if they were over $10, that was way too much. I don't know how much they sell on eBay today. But as time went by, and Gary and I wrote a book about Devil's Den, and I took on a whole chapter about photography at Devil's Den, I began to realize between the years 1884 and 1930, there were like 9 different photography firms that took photographs of images of people in front of the rocks of Devil's Den, and not less than 50,000 images of people in front of these rocks were recorded. And so when you see them on eBay and you find a photograph of a family or veterans in front of Devil's Den, see the one guy, he's got looks like a GAR hat on. You know, people think they're rare. They are not rare. And sometimes they sell for $200 or $300 on eBay, you know, but really, you know, I don't know how much something like this is worth. I guess it's worth as much as you want to pay for it if you're in that market. But I learned a lot looking at these photographs. And I don't have it in this particular image, but in some of the images you can see that there's a ladder sitting beside the rocks, where the camera would prop the ladder up and people would climb up onto a rock. You know, I doubt if in her Sunday best she climbed up to that spot. She probably just climbed up the ladder, got on, they take the ladder away. That's how you get people all over the rocks. They put them up there with a ladder. And this is a 1880s photograph because the rock carvings were removed in 1894. Now, Devil's Den is part of an igneous rock formation. And I remember, I mentioned this in a program, I think the Myth video we did not too long ago here. But when I was young, people often say that the rocks at Devil's Den were formed during the last ice age. The last ice age, you know, according to the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, is about 10,000 years ago. These are igneous rocks, part of a thing called the Gettysburg Sill. And the Gettysburg Sill ran from near Emmitsburg, Maryland, towards York Haven on the Susquehanna River. And it kind of runs across in an angle through our area. This area we're talking about is a mile wide. And so you'll have rocks like this, you know, through Devil's Den, Little Round Top, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, but they're not on Seminary Ridge. That's beyond the intrusion. And basically, millions of years ago, there was a sort of crack in the earth, and hardened molten magma bubbled up into the crack and formed underneath the earth's surface. And as the softer sediments and soils erode away, more and more of these rocks are exposed. And the idea is that, underneath the earth's surface, the rocks broke apart. And as time went by and the soil eroded away, rocks came to rest upon to each other. And then as more soil eroded away, the rocks just stood on top of each other until these weird-looking jumbles of rocks are exposed. And the ground will continue to erode away. And eventually, rock formations, because of erosion, will lean, tip over, and fall. And, I often tell the kids I have on tours at Devil's Den, school kids, that rock that's sitting on top of there, at one time, this was all under the Earth's surface. And that could have been 20 feet above the rock below it. But as erosion set in, this rock came to sit on the rock below it. And then as more erosion occurred, it started to lean. And one day, erosion will cause that rock to roll off of the rock above it. It might not happen tomorrow or the next day, but that rock will fall off of that rock one day. When Gary and I were working on the Devil's Den book, we came across a park report done by a doctoral thesis, I believe it was, and he did a whole study on that rock. And he figured out the weight of the rock. I forget how much he determined it was, but it's about 250 tons. And he determined that the park should be careful about that because the sidewalk goes right by it, and that might roll off and squash somebody one day. And so in 1978, the park put paint marks where the 3 points where the rocks touch each other. It only touches by 3 small points. And if you go out there today and look under the rock, you can see those paint points where the rock touches. And it hasn't moved at all since 1978. But we do have an occasional earthquake in the area, so I'm curious about that. But constantly the rocks are eroding. According to the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, the York Haven Diabase, as it's known as, is 201.2 million years old. So the people who say that the rocks were formed during the last ice age are off by over 200 million years. It's hard to imagine somebody being that far off. But it's fascinating. This formation on the side of Little Round Top is called the Curious Rock Formation. And I don't know enough about geology to tell you when this formation became totally exposed. But it's very precarious the way this formation sits. And today, I don't have the bravery that I once did as a young kid, but Gary and I spent many a day just sitting on top of that rock. So I'd kind of be afraid to climb up on it now, I think. I do know when I was younger, a girl in town, she fell off that rock and hurt herself very badly one time. But it's a very popular rock formation in front of Little Round Top. And we call it the Curious Rock Formation because that's what William Tipton called it in a photograph that he recorded of the rock in the 1880s. It's interesting that that same exact rock formation appears in a book, Benson Lossing's Pictorial History of the Civil War, published in 1866. And I had that book, and in it, it says Devil's Den. And Benson Lossing visited the battlefield in 1863. And so someone told him that rock formation was called Devil's Den. What I've come to realize over the years is that early on, any large group of rocks was named after the devil. And we have several mentions after the battle of Devil's Den that are not Devil's Den. that are a Little Round Top or someplace else. And just in our area, you might know, up near Penmar, out on the South Mountain Range, we have the Devil's Racecourse. Just in Frederick County, we have the Devil's Backbone. Of course, on the battlefield, we have the Devil's Kitchen, the Devil's Slipper, and all these places have that name because of their formations of rock. I think it comes from the Pennsylvania Germans, that they were farmers, and they plowed their fields, and they'd hit a rock. The devil was putting rocks in their field to mess with them. So any place with large amount of rocks is named after the devil. Of course, we wrote a whole book about Devil's Den, and I'm still not sure if it's called Devil's Den before the battle or it got its name afterwards. So here's a kind of a modern view of that same angle of those rocks on Little Round Top, taken just a couple years ago. This is an interesting photo. I remember Gary and I, Sue Boardman, I think, had purchased this photograph, and I got a copy of it from her. And early on, I'm going to talk about, I used to get photographs, mostly buy them in flea markets, or when I was old enough, made copies of images at Carlisle or the Library of Congress or the National Archives or the Gettysburg National Military Park. And I would prefer finding photographs of rocks. And then I would just go out on the battlefield and find the rocks. And this one baffled us for a few minutes. We had trouble figuring out where this was. But finally, we walked down and we found out that this image was taken from the top of that rock. A cameraman actually took his camera to the top of the rock and shot a photograph of the Warren Rock with visitors standing around General Warren. It took us a long time to figure out that General Warren is right there. But the camera angle is on top. We're on top of the Curious Rock Formation looking at General Warren. And that's one of Gary's favorite stories, I think, because for so long we didn't realize that General Warren is right there. And, they're not on the Warren Rock. They're on the rock in front of the Warren Rock. But, can you imagine people this photograph is probably 1910. It's one of those real photo postcards. But can you imagine the group of people being, hey, why don't you go down there, climb up on that rock formation and get our photograph up here? It's just too much. And then also I want to mention that, I just described the process that creates these rocks, the piles of rocks, but we have lots of deniers. And there's this guy, I mentioned him, I think he's a professor from New Jersey. I don't know if he's actually affiliated with any real college. John Anton, forensic geologist, whatever a forensic geologist is. You can look him up on the internet. He has lots of interesting stuff. But he is an expert on Native American sundials. And he has become convinced that this rock cannot possibly be from geology, that it was constructed by Native Americans. And on certain times of the year, if you stand at a certain spot and look through the gap in the rocks, like Stonehenge, you can see the sun, and it's just crazy. I have friends that are on the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. They're very competent geologists. And I'll never forget, about 15 years ago, they asked me to be the speaker at the state convention for the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. It was being held in Gettysburg. I'm like, what? I'm not a geologist. But they really liked the way that I talked about rocks and my enthusiasm of the rocks at Devil's Den. So I did a program to the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, and they just loved it. But I don't know how successful I was in some of my jokes. I told this joke during the proceedings, and I said something like, the rocks of Devil's Den, as you all know, are York Haven diabase, which is very similar in mineral composition and appearance to granite. But don't take the rocks for granted. And no one laughed. And then after the speech, one of the geologists came up and said, Mr. Smith, diabase and granite are not that similar. So, I get a big kick out of it. So I do have friends that are actual geologists, and you might notice in our Devil's Den book, which was written quite a long time ago now, 25 years ago, I actually have a section on the geology of Devil's Den, which, is as good as I could do at the time. Here is another image from Benson Lossing's Pictorial History of the Civil War called Signal Rock on Round Top, indicating that General Warren, maybe was here at some point. And I didn't put a modern photograph of this formation in here, but sure enough, this rock is between General Warren's statue and the monument to the 155th Pennsylvania would be right down there. So, there are sketches that were made after the battle of rock formations around the battlefield that are pretty accurate. Now, in our museum, we try to highlight some of the more famous rock formations in this Gettysburg sill that we talk about. And basically on the battlefield, we're talking about it being from, Big and Little Round Top, along Cemetery Ridge, and over through Culp's Hill and Rock Creek. But this area is referred to by locals as the Devil's Kitchen. I found an 1875 letter by Emanuel Bushman, who was complaining about all the snakes being located at the Devil's Kitchen. So we actually have that name early on. Elsie Singmaster, in one of her novels, we highlight her in our museum, in the early 1900s, I guess around 1920, she actually has the Devil's Kitchen by name in her book as a place where slaves hid during the days of the Underground Railroad. And there's a tour book by William Tipton in the 1890s, and he has this particular image in his book, and he calls it the Devil's Kitchen, and talks about how sharpshooters on the slopes of Big Round Top were firing at Little Round Top from the Devil's Kitchen. And so the Devil's Kitchen is located about halfway between the Big Round Top parking lot and the Devil's Den at the base of the hill. So the Devil's Den, or the Big Round Top parking lot being over here and the Devil's Den being down here. And of course, these names probably come about because of their close proximity to the Devil's Den. And of course, whether it was called Devil's Den before the battle or got its name right after the battle, Devil's Den is a name that was popularized immediately after the Civil War with early visitation to the battlefield, and it's been used, throughout our early literature. This is a formation called the Devil's Slipper. And this formation actually is on South Confederate Avenue at the base of Bushman's Hill. And I'd imagine in some of the accounts it's Devil's Slippers. Like this is one slipper on top of another slipper. And the park, when they put in that avenue, the Gettysburg National Military Park Commission in the 1890s had this area open, so as you're riding across the avenue, you could look over and see this formation. So they kind of made the avenue so that you could ride by some of these early rock formations. And the first usage of this name, the Devil's Slipper, that I can find is in the Park Commission report when this photograph was included in there. And you can go out to that site today. Although we don't keep the woods, this is taken in the winter, you can't really see it from the road in the summer. It's a few feet into the woods, but the Devil's Slipper. On Culp's Hill, there are a few large rock formations. We should mention that some of these rock formations were more rock formations on the battlefield. But prior to the Civil War, the rocks were being carved into granite stones that were used as the base of, like, the Adams County Courthouse, or the basements of buildings around town. There was a guy named Solomon Powers, and he was a stone cutter. And at one time, he owned Powers Hill. And if you go up on the Powers Hill, which is mostly publicly owned by the American Battlefield Trust or the part of the Gettysburg National Military Park, you can walk along and see the quarries where rocks were quarried out of the ground for building and construction purposes. and you can see where the rocks are chiseled. But early on, they didn't quarry, they didn't dig in around the ground to find rocks. They just took gigantic rock formations that were exposed and just broke them up. So we have no idea how many large rocks at one time were all over this area that had been removed prior to the Civil War, or even in the years after the Civil War before the ground was protected. This is an 1867 photograph of a rock on Culp's Hill, about halfway down the hill, and sometimes people call it the Confederate Sharpshooter's Rock. And behind this rock, Southerners undoubtedly hid to avoid the firing of the Northern soldiers on top of the hill. And here, that rock formation is still there today, and you can still see it. And the rock formation is featured in this famous oil painting by Alfred Woad, actually based, or this was Edwin Forbes. Woad and Forbes were both on the battlefield afterwards. Of course, I could be wrong now. I know Forbes took other ones. This could be a Woad. But they sketched the battlefield, and later they made, this is Forbes. It says Edwin Forbes right there, duh. And then they made them into these oil paintings. But this particular rock formation is there, and so is that one still there in the trenches of the Northern Army. But you can see why they might want to hide behind that rock. This tree, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Also, on Big Round Top, we have this famous rock formation that in the 1890s, I think maybe in 1896 or 1898, in the Park Commission report, they actually refer to as the Sphinx. And it's on the backside of Big Round Top. And early on, people would walk around Big Round Top to see it. This photograph is from 1867. And Peter Weaver has a number of photographs of this rock early on, and locals were pointing it out. They were pointing it out, but the name they attached to the rock was not politically correct. So what I find interesting, in the 1890s, the War Department went out of its way to publicize the name as the Sphinx, and they put it in one of their books so that people would know the dead rock is the Sphinx and stop using the other local name that was being used for it that was not good. And we won't even tell you it was so bad. But here, it's always been one of my favorite rock formations. And, when I was a kid, the park created a nature trail on Big Round Top. And you went on the Big Round Top, instead of going up to the top of the hill, it was called Loop Trail. And you went around the base of Big Round Top. And on the trail map, they have a brochure. You would stop and see a coffee tree, and you would see poison ivy, and you would see some breastworks built by the Northern Army. It was sort of a nature trail. They would talk about snakes and birds. But one of the stops on the map on the tour was the Sphinx. So early on, I knew about the Sphinx. And again, Gary and I would go out there when we were young, and we'd climb on top of the rock. That's what we did. We climbed on top of rocks. It doesn't seem like a good idea today, maybe. Now, what's really interesting about this rock formation, you might know, in August of 2001, an ash tree fell over and hit the rock and knocked the Sphinx off the top of the bottom rock. And that's the same angle, believe it or not. And Gary's standing on the tree over there, upset about it. We did a video about it right after somebody told us it happened. It's right near the horse trail. And so somebody was on the horse trail, noticed a tree had hit it. Do you remember there's a blight of the ash tree? And a bunch of them died. And on Big Round Top, this formation that had been there for millions of years, a tree hit it, and now it's gone. So these things, although we tend to think of them as permanent because they're there, for generations and, in all our lives, can be destroyed. I've been doing this since I was a little kid. My family lived in Baltimore, and I think it was in 1978, 1979, we moved up to Carroll County. And so I lived like 12 miles from here, just on the other side of the Maryland line. And I could ride my bike to Gettysburg and did often. And I used to collect photographs. This is my brother. And I would bring them up, and we would go around the battlefield, and we would look for rocks. And I'd collect photographs of rocks. You know, I'd get them into flea markets. I'd buy postcards, anywhere I can get rocks. Gary took this photograph of me at Devil's Den, and, you know, Robert E. Lee magically appeared behind me on the rock. I don't know how that happened. So that's Gary's favorite photograph. And I remember I found this one in a local flea market. And I would take, and this was just a hobby for me, you know. I would take photographs. This is a real photo postcard, and it has a rock in it and a tree. And I would go out and find the rocks. Now, it's really funny because I didn't have any idea on the battlefield where that photograph was taken. You know, it didn't tell me where the image was taken. I just kind of figured that in the background that was a height of ground with some trees on it, probably Little Round Top. So I looked along the base of Little Round Top. That tree was no longer there. And, you know, I found that particular rock. You can kind of see in that where this is right there. But, and then I would take a photograph of the modern spot. I remember we got so good at it, I got this photograph on my first trip to the Adams County Historical Society when they had a Henry Stewart photo album. And I was really intrigued by this rock, and I took it home. My brother said to me, "Yeah, I know where that rock is." And he knew where the rock was before we even went out to look for the rock. But it was on the side of Big Round Top. And I think sometimes, you know, people know I have a good memory. My brother's memory is a little bit better, although he does not put it to good use. And of course, you know, Gary and I met in I'm going to guess it was, boy, he probably knows the exact date. I'm going to guess we met in 1990. It might have been 1989. And we became friends. Gary lived in Chicago. And so Gary would come out for a week, hang out at my house in town, and then we would go around the battlefield and look for rocks. And Gary first attracted my attention as a person who was interested in rocks because he came to Gettysburg. I had worked in a relic shop here, of course, buying and selling Civil War photographs with rocks in them. And he came in and he told me that he found the location of this photograph. Now, this photograph was in William Frassinito's first book, Gettysburg, A Journey in Time, but no one knew where this image was recorded. Nobody knew where this body was laying or what rocks they were. And he discovered the location. So he wanted me to get in touch with Fries because I had already known him and bring him to meet Gary at the site so he could show him. And Gary did. But then Fries announced that another person a couple years earlier had already discovered the site, and he was going to print that in his new book, Early Photography at Gettysburg, and give the other guy credit. But Gary found the location on his own without the help of anyone else, and I was very impressed by that. So I hope he won't watch this and see me say that. Now, of course, we're both enamored by the work of William Frassinito, and of course the concept, maybe I already had the concept in my head as a kid, but photographs were taken at a certain location, and by lining up the rocks in the photographs, you could go to that site and you could stand at that same location today with the photograph and see the area. And a lot of people are really into that, the then and now concept. And Fraz, of course, is the one who opened a lot of us up to the possibilities of studying this concept. And for me, it wasn't just that. It's not just standing at the spot where the Confederate bodies were lined up. When Fraz initially found that site, I should say William Frassinito, if you don't know who Fraz is, who will be here tonight. He's the speaker tonight. When he first discovered this site, this area was wooded. And with his location of that discovery of the position of that rock right there, with his discovery of that particular rock. He took that photograph and looked on the battlefield for that one rock. And not only did he not know where the rock was, he had descriptions telling him the rock was in a different spot and couldn't find it in those other spots before he finally found it here. This area was all wooded. And with his help, the National Park Service has now restored the wood line to its Civil War appearance. And I don't know when I started to realize that lining up these photographs and finding these positions of these rocks shows us what that area looked like at the time that photograph was taken, and that actually can assist us in helping the park to restore the battlefield or learning about the changes of the Gettysburg National Military Park over the years. Alexander Gardner recorded that photograph of dead at the Rose Farm, and Alexander Gardner recorded the images of dead at the slaughter pen. And this is an image that doesn't get the attention of a lot of the other images there. Alexander Gardner recorded perhaps 6 or 7 images all right in this area. And 3 of them are looking across at the edge of the tree line on the slopes of Big Round Top from Plum Run. In this photograph, actually Plum Run is right down there. And you can see this table-like boulder, according to William Frasinito, in the middle of the view. And this has actually been in books for many years, and it's said to be Little Round Top and the site where the 20th Maine fought against the 15th Alabama, according to Miller's photographic history of the Civil War in 1911, and then a Gettysburg book he published in 1913. But people thought this was Little Round Top. And in 1967, Bill discovered the site of that rock and realized that this is actually in the slaughter pen at Devil's Den, and not Little Round Top. You can see the bodies that appeared in this image. And there's that rock today. But about 20 years ago, I don't even remember the date anymore. Oh, let's see. Sam was alive. So 15 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, the park started a project to clear this area out. And using this image, I went out and helped assist the park in placing where the tree line would be moved back to from Devil's Den on the slopes of Big Round Top. And of course, I was using William Frasinito's work, who had written about it in his early photography of Gettysburg. We were best friends, so it wasn't a big stretch. I think the Park Service would prefer to do things in the daytime when Bill is not available. You know, he sleeps until like 4 o'clock. So we took this image, and we took this formation of rocks, and I know it's really hard to see under this magnification. And just to give you an idea, I'm making it kind of easier for you guys, and try to find out where these rocks are, because this is right at the edge of the tree line. And of course, I spend my whole life, knowing each of these rocks. And here's the same rocks today. And you can see the same formation. I just try to make it easier there. Maybe you can see, if I go back, you can see that this one has a little shadow in it there. Oh, it's not really there on this one. But there's the same rocks today. So, and using it's not just that, but using other information. And the park actually made a map showing all the different, they call it the key boulder, and anchor rock, according to Tim Smith. Yeah. I get a kick out of this because this is an actual National Park Service, study. And who am I? Well, I was a tour guide, but who am I to be involved in this project? But anchor rock. Also, I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Troth rock, that is absolutely 100% my name for that rock. And then this is a Smiley rock. I have a whole story I'm going to tell you about that. But they made a study of the formation. This is the trolley path they're showing you. Now, when William Frasinito's book came out in the 1970s, Gettysburg: A Journey in Time, there were photographs in the book, and he did not know the locations of. And here's 4 photographs 3 by the C.J. Tyson stereos and 1 by Weaver. And early on, I'd read his book and I knew about these photographs that he desired to find the location of, but was unable to. But you know what I noticed right away? Hey, there's rocks in the photographs. Now, what happened is I guess I ended up moving to Gettysburg, working at a relic shop, and realizing that you could purchase original copies of these images and they were floating around. I became knowledgeable not just about rocks, but about Civil War photography and the original stereo views by these different photographers and what they looked like. And even if I didn't have access to an original myself, I could go to Carlisle, to the War Barracks, and look through the Mollis collection. Or I could go to the National Archives where William Tipton donated Tyson's collection after Tipton's son donated to the National Archives after he died. And of course, the Gettysburg National Military Park had a large amount of photographs. I should mention that early on, when I was doing this, I'd go to the park library and I didn't really find that the park was interested in this study. I found this incredibly valuable to take these photographs out and line them up and say, okay, the tree line was right there. But I think it was a while before they caught on to this idea that you could do this. Specifically, and I'm not bashing the park, I'm just mentioning that they weren't really into this. Or they didn't even study the photographers, and they didn't even have an idea what year the photograph was taken. So knowing the difference between an 1867 photograph and an 1890 photograph was really important to me, because you're trying to get closer to the time of the battle if you're trying to restore a tree line. And you probably know it wasn't until the 2000s that the park really became interested in restoring the actual Civil War battle tree lines. So I remember one day I was in the park library and I'm looking at photographs, and one of the park historians is in the office with, it sounded like a guy from the state archives. And the guy at the state archives had brought her some photographs to look at. And they were in there and they were talking. I could not see the photographs, but I could hear their conversation. And they flashed up this photograph, and I don't remember, I have no idea what the photograph was, but I think it was a reunion of the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. And the guy at the state said something like, look, you see that rock they're standing on? I wonder if you could go out there and you could figure out what rock that is. And then they went on to the next one. I'm like, yes, you can go out there and do that. I was really obsessed by this. And again, I don't know exactly why. This is a C.J. Tyson stereo view, and I purchased an original on the original mount from 1867. And I was determined to find this location. This is the only Tyson view that is included in the Miller's Photographic History of the Civil War, the 10-volume set that came out in 1911. So it's a tree that was damaged by artillery fire on Culp's Hill. And of course, behind it, there's a lot of trees that were damaged during the battle. And in stereo, I could see that this is a long, flat, skinny rock, and that this is a pointy rock that the tree is laying on. And Charlie Fennell, one of my colleagues, a licensed battlefield guide, always suspected that this tree is the same tree that appears in that Forbes painting that we just saw. And sure enough, not far from that location, I discovered these rocks in 1993. So there I am sitting at the site of my discovery with my bushy black hair. I had a lot of black hair then. But, and then I, took these discoveries to William Frassinito. And then he, at this point, gave me a whole bunch of his original stereo cards, and I went on the battlefield with him, and I found a whole bunch of these views. So I ended up, in that book we were talking about, I identified the locations of all 4 of those views that he didn't know where they were at that time. And I got really good at that, finding photographs. He sent me out with this one, and I found the location of this Matthew Brady 1863 view based on that particular rock right there, which, it shows up. You have to have a nice copy of it to see it. And so I started to do that for different people. Now, I was also not just interested in the battle. I'm interested in commercialization of the battlefield. And when we worked on our Devil's Den book, I wanted to find a location of the Devil's Den the Devil's Den photographic studio. So there was a photographic studio at Devil's Den where cameramen took photographs of visitors, and I really wanted to find the site. So I made a specific, I went on a specific mission. I went to every flea market in the area, everyone in Gettysburg. Do you remember Mel's Antiques? Love that. I went to New Oxford, I went to Hanover, everyone in the area, and I looked at tin types. Tin types are on, the black tin. There's no writing on the back. They're in flea markets everywhere. They're mostly generic views of people, but I wanted ones that had rocks in them. And I collected a whole bunch of them. I'm sure I have the largest collection of tin types taken at Devil's Den or Little Round Top in existence. Of course, I gave all my stuff here to the Historical Society. And this one, I actually found at the Historical Society. This is Henry Stort, and he worked for William Tipton at his gallery on the backside of Little Round Top. Again, I'm looking for the Devil's Den photographic studio. I ended up finding like 6 views of people standing in front of a large rock. It turns out this is the same rock from a whole bunch of different angles. And I went out on the backside of Little Round Top and I found that rock. Now, let me just tell you, tin type is a reverse image. So I was going around holding the tin type with a mirror in my hand, looking for the same rock. And I found it on Little Round Top. And so now I have I think I have 8 views of this studio. And eventually, I found this in a local flea market. I think I paid $2 for it. And I was able to go to Devil's Den and find that rock. And thereby I had an idea all of a sudden where the tin type gallery was at Devil's Den. The tin type gallery at Devil's Den was there from 1885 until 1902. And these are also photographs that were taken of visitors at Devil's Den. Most of the tin type gallery images, they just pull down a screen, and on the screen is like a scene at the beach, and they'll pull down another screen, there's some trees, or they pull down another screen and you're in a house, and you just get your photograph taken in front of it. But I needed for them to say, wow, it's a really nice day, the sun's pretty good, let's go outside the studio and we'll set up our camera in front of the rocks. And so, I just got lucky and they were available. Now, when Gary and I started working on our book, Devil's Den, A History and Guide, and I think this was taken the day we picked up our books at the publisher, the day it came out. And so Gary was always posing as, Alfred Woad. So I guess we use that on our lecture series as our advertisement. So Gary loves that. But we made a bunch of discoveries, and I think some of these discoveries in the Devil's Den book I had been making previous to working on the book. I don't know how long we worked on the Devil's Den book, maybe 3 years together. But we'd been hanging out for a while prior to that, and even before that with my brother. I was going on the battlefield. This is a photograph from, I first learned about it in a book called They Met at Gettysburg by Edward Stackpole, and still one of my favorite books. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean it's a good book. It's my favorite book. It doesn't mean it's good or accurate or anything like that, or I agree with the stuff in it. There's some stuff I really hate in the book, but it's one of my favorite books. And in it, he's got this image. As Geary's scouts saw the terrain early in the morning of July 2nd, oh, I love that. When John White Geary's division was on Little Round Top, before they went over to Culp's Hill and were replaced, by Sickles' 3rd Army Corps. So, and it's a soldier. It leads you to believe that this is a photograph taken from Little Round Top looking across. And of course, again, I read that book when I was in high school, so I'm like, hey, I got to find this rock. It's got a crack in it. There's a crack in the rock. I can find that. And I did find that rock at Devil's Den. And this is a Mumper photograph from the 1870s. Mumper got a soldier's uniform, dressed somebody up, and took him around the battlefield and was taking photographs of him. And actually not around the battlefield. I think there's six or eight of these photographs, these stereo cards. They're all the same soldier. They're all at Devil's Den. So, but here's one of them. And we're actually on top of the rocks of Devil's Den, looking across the slopes of Big Round Top. The summit of Big Round Top would be up there. So it's not Little Round Top. Oh, but he only said the Little Round Top area. But this is what I like about this when I don't do it much anymore, but when I had this hobby, I'm spending hours on Little Round Top looking for this rock, and it's not there. Now, some of my more dramatic discoveries, this is probably one of them. This photograph, I've only ever seen one copy of it, and Sue Boardman could correct me if she's not here at the moment, but I've only seen one version of this. And this comes from the William Tipton sample album here at the Adams County Historical Society. And this is actually before I worked here at the Historical Society. So there's this image. Colonel John Wheeler, 20th Indiana Volunteers, killed in action July 2nd, 1863. And you can see you're on top of a rise of ground and there's a field in the background. We know where the 20th Indiana fought. And I'm like, wow, this is a really interesting image. So I wanted to see if I could find that rock. No one knows anything about it, when I'm talking to people about it. A lot of people didn't know the photograph existed. Again, it's in a original William Tipton sample album given to the Adams County Historical Society by William Tipton's granddaughter. So I got a copy of it, and I found the location. Now that sounds simple, doesn't it? Now how would you do that in today's world? Let's say you see a book and it has a photograph in it. How would you make the photograph? How would you be able to find it? You can't remember it, so you have to make a copy of it, right? So I'm just going to suggest you whip out your cell phone, you take a photograph copy of it, and then you're on the battlefield with your cell phone and you find a rock. But that's not how it was done then. I had to bring in my copy stand. I had to set up my lights. I had a 35 millimeter camera with close-up lenses on it. And I set up the tripod, and I got the photograph, and I got a clear version of it, and I shot the photograph. And then I had to take the film to a camera shop. And then they had to send it away somewhere. And then a few days later, I went and picked it up. And then I hoped that the photograph turned out all right. I didn't have to go back and shoot it again. Because you don't know what the photograph turns out for a few days. What is it all about? And then I took the copy of the photograph out onto the battlefield and discovered the location of the rock. I tell people that because they seem to forget that it was a process back then. So I was always in an archives making copies with my close-up lens on my camera and light stand of these images so I could get good versions of them. And I found that rock. Now, it turns out that that rock was not far from the 20th Indiana's memorial. And not far from Sickles Avenue, and Devil's Den is up over there, and a wheat field is behind us. But I'd found that rock. Or actually, you know what? I'm wrong. It's been a while since I've been out there. The wheat field is over there. Devil's Den's behind us, and that's not Sickles Avenue. That's there it would be called Cross Avenue. But if you're interested, on Facebook, Andrew made one of those blended images where you can push the button and it fades in from the historic image to the site now. I didn't put it in the show because it would be too complicated for me to understand how to get that from YouTube onto here. I'm sure that you guys could do it. But everyone is just astounded by the fact that that rock is the rock that used to have that. How many monuments were there like that at one time that we don't know about? Where there was a wooden headboard that said something on it about what happened at that spot, or a stake in the ground, or somebody painted on a rock. And if it wasn't for that image being in, the William Tipton sample album here given to us by his granddaughter, we would not know that for many years, there was a rock that had that painted on it that was on the site of where John Wheeler was killed. And the park really, really, really likes that. The park did, the Gettysburg Foundation and National Military Park did a little walking tour of Devil's Den, and they have that photograph in their walking tour if you want to get that at the park and take it out there. This is, I mentioned earlier on a map, this is the Trough Rock. So named by me because there's a trough cut into the rock with water. And actually, the trough is not for horses to drink out of. There's a stream right here called Plum Run, and it might be kind of bloody still, but the horse can drink out of that. This is actually a trough that was created to provide fresh water for the photographic studio that was right next door. And you can see the shadow of the roof of the Gettysburg Devil's Den tintype gallery. And they also were reproducing photographs of people in front of the rocks of Devil's Den. Remember I said that there were thousands of images taken of visitors in front of the rocks? But this is actually Charles Tyson Tipton, William Tipton's son, who owned the photographic studio for a while. And he's on his horse in front of the rocks. And we actually got a collection of images. I should put it in here, a much better one. We got a collection of images from the Tipton family, and it says that's Charles Tyson Tipton. I don't want to get too far out, but let me tell you the story. So one day when I was younger, I don't know how old I was, in my early 20s, William Frassinito and I are walking through the Evergreen Cemetery. And I saw William Tipton's grave, and we were talking about William Tipton, and then beside him I saw, wow, Charles Tyson Tipton. Well, actually, he's not in the same plot. He's in a different plot. And I was like, Bill, William Tipton named his son after his mentor, Charles Tyson. When I get older and I get married and I have a boy, I'm going to name him William Frassinito Smith. And so, fast forward, I'm married, my wife's pregnant, and Bill comes up to me, how's little William Frassinito Smith doing? And you may know the end of the story. My son's name is Sam. So this is from Mike Warricker, who got this image. I forget where he said he found it in collections at the Gettysburg National Military Park, but a carriage. And you can see the roof of the tintype gallery at Devil's Den and a horse drinking out of the trough. And if you want to, Gary and I were really interested in the trough. I guess what happened was Gary was trying to figure out the location of a series of photographs that were taken by Alexander Gardner at Devil's Den, and he took me down there, and early on he had theorized that this rock appeared in one of the background in one of the photographs, and it turned out that wasn't right. But ever since that, we were always interested in the rock. And in our Devil's Den book, when we finally wrote the book, we had a little section about the Trough Rock, and I talked about how, people have suggested it was a natural trough in the rock, but you can see chisel marks, and clearly it's man-made. And anyway, in one of the footnotes, Gary decided to put something funny in the footnote to see if our editor was paying attention. And he put something in there like, and the authors have recently heard of a dish specific to this rock containing lima beans, corn, potatoes, and 1 vial of water from the Trough Rock, known as Trough Rock stew. And to make the long story short, it went through the editor, didn't even catch it, and it's in our book to this day in the footnote. And Gary kind of encourages the idea that we, after each photographic adventure looking for rocks, would drink the Trough Rock stew. And there's the Trough Rock during the clearing about 15 years ago when they were restoring the tree line to its Civil War appearance based on the photographs. Here's a nice, Gary's really into the panoramic views that Alexander Gardner recorded. So instead of shooting the slaughter pen, which was off to our right in Big Round Top, this is looking across the valley towards Little Round Top. And the Library of Congress has these in incredibly high resolution. You can download them, you can zoom in, you can see the breastworks on Little Round Top, and you can see the rocks in the valley. You can see rocks that are missing today, where the road went through. And you can take these images out and line them up, make your own panoramas. That's not a very good, I didn't do a very good job there. But you can see the same rocks, in the same site today. Now this rock is interesting. Like I said, we spent countless hours looking for one photograph of one rock. Gary, you go over there and you look for it. I'll go over here and we'll look for it. And, we look for these rocks. And I'm not showing you all the different images we searched for and all the different discoveries we made. And every one of the discoveries we made was the most important discovery ever made. And Gary just mentioned the prop stones and how much we learned about the battle by discovering that. But this rock, we'd park here in the parking lot, we come across the bridge, and it always appeared to me that this rock was jeering at us in defeat every time we didn't find the rocks we were looking for. Do you see? And Gary and I called it the smart ass rock because it's smirking at us. And so what's really interesting is we figured out later, here's a photograph by Alexander Gardner taken, after the battle, a week after the battle. And you can see it was hazy. It had been raining that day. And we're looking from the top of the rocks of Devil's Den across Plum Run. And right there is that rock. And that's where the Plum Run Bridge would be. And if you enhance it, there's a dead soldier right beside that rock. And it's just amazing to stand at that rock today at the edge of the bridge and think about there was a dead soldier there. And you see how it's just got that grin on its face. So, and I don't remember why, but I told the park, map maker that I referred to it as the smart-ass rock. And I don't know why I even put it on the map, but he renamed it. He didn't appreciate my name. I really get a kick out of that. There's other rocks that I really like they're kind of interesting that we discovered. One of them is this story. So some of my friends started to share on their Facebook post a number of years ago that this lady had a photograph of her ancestor behind the rock where he was wounded during the battle, and he came back in 1910 to the same location, to the same area, and laid against the same rock. And her relatives have even made a video of it. They even went, on July 2nd, the 148th fought in the middle of the wheat field. And they went into the woods near the monument to Edward Cross, and they discovered the location of that rock. And I watched the video and I was like, that's not the rock. That doesn't even look like that rock at all. And some of my other friends realized that they were wrong in their video, so they wanted to find the location of the rock. And so they kind of posted it all over Facebook. But I noticed something. I noticed two things that no one else seemed to notice. One of them was I looked him up, and he was wounded on July 3rd, not July 2nd. And the other thing was, do you see the date of the photograph? The same date as the dedication of the Pennsylvania Monument. And guess where the 148th were on the third day of the battle? Near the Pennsylvania Monument. So I went to the Pennsylvania Monument, which I guess I cropped it out. I guess it's right over there in the view. And I just walked back in the field and found the rock with the slash in it. It's not very convincing, and I should have put some more in so you could see, but this is the same rock that he's behind. So, and I was very proud of that. I guess I got a reputation for being interested in rocks. One day, this guy came into the visitor center, had a relative in 155th Pennsylvania, and he had a photograph of his relative from 1913, and he's standing behind a rock where he was shot. So I went out to Little Round Top with this guy and his photograph. This is all I got of it. I didn't get a good version of it. It's just I got a Xerox of it when he was visiting. And we found a rock behind which his relative was behind. Again, you get a photograph of a rock where somebody was wounded. You go to that rock. You can go to the same spot. You can touch that rock. It's always something that I've been interested in. One of my favorite all-time things, everybody will tell you, is I discovered from two different photographs taken about 20 years apart, 10 years apart, that there was a rock for many years in the middle of the wheat field road. This would be on the west end of the wheat field. And I guess in your carriage, you drove around this huge rock that was in the middle of the road. To this day, I do not know when that rock was removed from the middle of the road. But obviously, it was after 1898. I think this one is this is an 1880s image, and this is an 1898 image. But there are things I still haven't discovered that I was really interested in. These are the balancing rocks on Wolf's Hill near McAllister Dam. And apparently this rock was perfectly balanced on a rock below it. And according to an article in the newspaper, when the wind blew, this rock would just rock back and forth on top of the rock below it. You could hear it rocking. I've looked for this, and I cannot find it. I've come to the conclusion, and when I say I looked for it, it's not like I looked for it for an hour. Several days over my lifetime I've looked for this. Who knows how many hours. This rock does not exist. So my current theory is that this must be pushed over, that this rock was knocked off the rock below it. And I haven't spent as much time looking for it now, but I'm probably looking for a rock that is laying down or rolled down the hill. Maybe this is just by itself somewhere and this one's nearby. But that's one we're really interested in. The Balancing Rocks of Wolf's Hill, it's called. So again, according to one article, it's not far from McAllister Mill. Now, this rock on Little Round Top is right behind General Warren. When I was young, and this had to be in the 70s, I met this guy, and his father was a park guide, a park guard, a guy hired by the War Department to watch over the battlefield, and he had like a guard shack at Devil's Den. And this guy took me on Little Round Top one day. He's long since deceased. His name was Weichert, and he showed me this rock. If you climb up on this rock and stand there with your foot and bounce, this rock moves back and forth. It's perfectly balanced, and it'll just bounce up and down like a seesaw. And he told me when he was a kid that this rock would just blow back and forth in the wind, that it was balanced so perfectly. I don't know, that's the story. And other things are interesting about rocks, like rock carvings. One time, Devil's Den was covered with carved and painted graffiti. And you probably know, in 1894, the park sent in the government chiselers, and they removed the carvings from the rocks. So today, Devil's Den has lots of chisel marks in it where the rock carvings have been removed. But there are other rock carvings on the battlefield that are pretty famous that are still out there and you can find. Near Spangler Spring, and I shouldn't tell you exactly where they are because we want you to go out and try to find them. At Spangler Spring, there's Augustus Lawrence Coble of the 1st North Carolina Regiment. The park files actually contains a letter with a picture of A.L. Coble, and the letter's by his son, and he says that his father came here during a reunion and they carved his name into the rock at the place where he was standing on the 3rd day of the battle, firing into the Northern Army. And sure enough, one of the park rangers, John Heiser, actually found his name for receiving money as a veteran who attended Gettysburg during the 1913 reunion. So this is probably done in 1913. And when I was a kid, and this would have been this was in the 70s, again, 78 maybe, a tour guide showed me that. That is something that had been known. I did not discover that or anything like that. He just showed me where it was. On Culp's Hill, there's A.W. Leitner, 1871, P. Sox, 1871. They're in front of the monument for the 122nd New York, and their names are carved onto the rocks. Locals carved their name in the rocks. There's a famous rock carving on the Weichert farm, the John T. Weichert farm in front of Little Round Top, DA 140 PV. And it's supposedly done after the battle and then greatly improved in later years. But this was done by soldiers to mark where they had buried one of their comrades, David Atchison of the 140th Pennsylvania Volunteers. Of course, on Little Round Top, there's a rock carving for Charles Hazlitt at the spot he fell. And of course, there's one for Colonel Strong Vincent fell here. There is a great account in 1865 where a visitor's on Little Round Top and he sees this inscription. And, you know, some people say it's probably there as early as 1864. But we have an 1865 article about it. And this is right near the 44th New York Monument. We have this inscription that was obviously placed on a rock, the 40th New York Volunteers of Sickles, the Mozart Regiment. This is probably covered with water at the moment because of the Beaver Dam that I'm not happy about. But this rock is a place marker probably for the monument. So they carved initials in a rock in preparation for the monument being dedicated at that site. I discovered one for the 4th Maine. It's near the 4th Maine Infantry Memorial. Now you're probably like, how can you discover a rock carving? Wouldn't it have been known about for many, many years? Well, what happened was there was a fence. This was behind a fence, and this whole area had grown up with sticker bushes, and there were trees there. And then in the 1980s, the Park Service removed that fence. And then, I guess it was the early 90s. And then they had a Baltimore Civil War Roundtable came in, and they cleared this area of all its brush. And then all of a sudden, maybe one of those guys noticed it, but all of a sudden after that, I discovered this on a rock. And it's actually tinted, so the diamond is actually red. So, because they're in the 1st Division of the 3rd Army Corps. But it's not far from the 4th Maine Monument. And you can see that's professionally done. Again, I would say that's done prior to the monument being placed as a placeholder to tell people that, hey, we want our monument in this area. Of course, you know, Andrew, I think, mentioned at the time that I'd been on every rock on the battlefield. There's a huge rock called the Elephant Rock. And this is an 1867 photograph of it. And you can kind of see it looks like the ear of an elephant and the trunk of an elephant. That's why it gets that name. But here in this 1867 photograph, they just call it Huge Rock. They don't try to give it a name. But this is a Weaver photograph. And sure enough, I've been on top of that rock. And on top of that rock, there's an inscription. D. Forney. David S. Forney, 1849. So this is the oldest rock carving that I know of in the area of Devil's Den, 1849. And it wasn't chiseled out because what chiseler is going to go on top of that rock and get that off of there? I did a video on YouTube on the Gettysburg Daily, Bobby Hoosh's site. I think he still watched the videos. There's a flag carved into the top of that rock. And then here is a rock carving for P. Noel. There's a whole ghost story about this rock carving now. Have you heard of that? It was in Haunted Gettysburg by Bob Wassell. But he made up the story that Paulina Noel, you know, was on the battlefield in a wagon with her father after the Civil War. He was farming the area. And the horse was scared by a rattlesnake that came out of Devil's Den. So she was thrown from the wagon onto the ground, and then the horse ran away, and the wheel rode over her neck and severed her head. And that night, with the fiery finger of hell, she carved her name into the rocks. What I determined that the guy's name was Park Knoll. It's not even Noel. Park Knoll. And Park Knoll lived on Mummersburg Street in the town of Gettysburg for many years. He was a stone cutter. And he was working with the crew that helped to wreck the 4th New York Independent Battery, and it carved his name in the rock. That's not as exciting as the other story, but there's lots of rock carvings that the chiselers tried to get out. And you can, if you go to Devil's Den and look for the chisel marks, you can kind of see some of the inscriptions under the rock. I love this story. So here's a rock on the top of Devil's Den. There was a tree here, a big tree. The park cleared the top of Devil's Den, and this probably was about 10 years ago. They cleared the trees off the top, and this tree was taken down. This rock was covered with moss and lichen. And all of a sudden, there was no tree beside it, and there was no shade. And all the moss and lichen died. And I was walking by it one day, and I saw something, unusual, and I stopped, and this is colorized by a friend of mine, but you can see John Houck, May 18th, 1867. And I just love it when we find a new rock carving. Do you know who John Houck is? He's the owner of Devil's Den at the time of the battle. Yeah, Houck's Ridge. So John Houck carved his name in Devil's Den right after the 1867, and it's still there if you know where to look. There's other carvings on buildings, like here's a carving for Henry Howard Wirt. His father wrote about the Rose Farm in the 1880s. I guess he worked for his father's aunt at the Rose Farm for a while. She was married to William Weibel when it was Weibel's Woods and the Weibel Farm. And he carved his name into a stone at the Rose Barn. Now, I should mention, here you go. We do not know where this rock carving is. We cannot find it. This is in the Park Commission book, I believe. And this is a nicer version of it. But it says graffiti on rock. And it says in the caption, above Spangler Spring, indicating it's somewhere on the slopes of Culp's Hill. And there's a rock back there. This is a long, skinny rock. Gary and I have spent countless hours looking for it. I think that's the trench line right there. I don't know if, I just can't find it. Maybe it's been scratched out, but I just cannot find this rock. I cannot line it up with anything. Some of the rocks, you have to admit, they've been moved or taken away because of road improvements and other reasons. One of our greatest, I got just two more things here at the end. One of Gary and I's greatest discoveries. There was an article in the paper in 1906 about a swimming hole where Gettysburg kids like to swim. It was called Two Rocks. Apparently there were two rocks near each other. And the kids would swim in a deep hole in Rock Creek near Two Rocks. I like to call it, that's how I like to refer to it. And we became obsessed with finding this location of Two Rocks. So we only had a photograph from the newspaper, and it wasn't very good. I got a better copy from the newspaper, and eventually I found a Gettysburg Compiler booklet that was printed in 1906, and they ran a better copy of Two Rocks. And apparently, in the days up to and after the Civil War, this is where all the Gettysburg kids swam. And there was a description of how you're supposed to get there. And so we followed the description down the creek, and we armed with that photograph. I should say that this was over the course of about 5 years. This was something we did all the time, look for Two Rocks. And finally, one day, I found Two Rocks. This is a swimming hole. I haven't gone across the creek and taken the photograph from the same angle, but I'm standing on one of the Two Rocks, and this is the swimming hole. And just as a point of reference, it's in the creek right there, and the modern Confederate Avenue goes down here and crosses over a stream at the base of Culp's Hill, and this is where the road turns, and Jones's Brigade Infantry tablet is right there, and you can see the corner of the stone walls, and then Two Rocks is over there. So it's on the Culp farm before you really get to Culp's Hill. We love Culp's Hill. Love this image. You see the rock in Rock Creek. I wonder why it's called Rock Creek. This is another a close-up of it. This is from Sue Boardman's collection. Do you see this rock back here? We call this the Rhino rock. See the Rhino rock. This is a different variant of that Tyson image. And Fraz knew where this was, but we went out and we located that rock. We walked along the creek until we could find it. Here it is on a rainy day. I think just a couple years ago I wanted to shoot a close-up of it, but it was really nasty and raining that day. I love this rock. It's got a distinctive crack on it and moss growing all over it. This is an 1867 Tyson Brothers image, and there's that rock today. And this is one of Gary and I's favorite rocks. We had to find this. It's a Walt. This was in copied by Walt Lane. It's a Tipton photograph, and it was in a book I had when I was a kid. What was it called? Gettysburg, The Long Encampment. And we found that rock, and I wish I had a modern photograph of Gary and I, but we took our photograph in the same spot. And then the footbridge across Rock Creek near McAllister's Mill, we located this footbridge site by identifying the rocks in the photograph. And then McAllister's Mill. You know, there are postcards of the dam from McAllister's Mill. And we tried to line them up and we were unable to. And we kind of have an idea where McAllister Dam was. And there's lots of photographs with rocks in it. Finally, I walked up and down the creek and I was able to find that rock. And then realized that this is not McAllister's Dam, that this was another dam closer to the Baltimore Pike that was made to throw water into a race for a sawmill. And McAllister's up here, and McAllister's Dam obviously is above the mill, and this is a totally different dam. But armed with that knowledge, we eventually were able to find a photograph of the original McAllister Dam, which had been broken by the time of this photograph in 1867. That's Samuel Weaver with his beard. And then we were able to find that site based on the photographs. Now, I don't think all the images and the rocks photographs that I find are that important. And like I said, Gary tends to make fun of us when we spend a lot of time discovering something that is a very minute point and doesn't really help to educate the public in any way. But we do the best we can. I discovered this photograph in the Eastman Kodak Museum, Rochester, and it said it was Harper's Ferry, but it said Round Top at Harper's Ferry, and that's Big Round Top. And for many years, Big Round Top had a flag flying over it. We are on the slopes of Little Round Top. The 44th New York Monument would be right there, and we are in where you drive up in your car on Little Round Top, and this is where the buses park, the bus parking space, which I'm sure has been eliminated. And it's going to be totally different next time I go there because, Little Round Top's being worked on. But I don't think the park is going to do this, but all the early photographs show the tree line on Little Round Top was on the east side of where the current road is. On the early photographs, there are no trees in the area where the 44th New York Monument is and the 83rd Pennsylvania Monument is. All that area is clearly open. And we can see that in 1863 photographs. We can see that in this 1881 photograph before the avenue was put in 1882. And, it's just if we want to restore Little Round Top's tree line to its historic appearance, we have to pull it back off the top of the hill and move it back to in this area. This would be the path that leads out to the 20th Main Monument into a different location. And I don't know if the park is on board with doing that. So, but we can only show them what we discover and talk about the photographs. Well, thanks for attending my rather lengthy program about rocks at Gettysburg.